And we're live with JavaScript Air. Hello, everyone. My name is Kent C. Dodds, and I'm your host for JavaScript Air. And today we're going to be talking about Lodash and JavaScript utils. I switched that. The title of the show is JavaScript utils and Lodash, but I don't think the order is very relevant. So we've got John David Dalton with us, and so we're going to be chatting with him about that. But before we get into introductions, I just have a couple of announcements. First, a shout out to all of our wonderful sponsors who make so many wonderful things possible for this podcast. First, our premier sponsor is Egghead.io. Egghead.io is has a huge library of bite-sized videos about web development in general. Check them out for content on JavaScript, Angular, React, Node, and Elm, and all kinds of really cool stuff. Then Frontend Masters is an expert-led workshop with courses on advanced JavaScript, asynchronous and functional JS, as well as lots of other great courses on front-end topics, so check them out. Then Track.js reports bugs in your JavaScript before customers even notice them, and with their telemetry timeline, you'll have the context to actually fix them. Check them out and start tracking JavaScript errors today at trackjs.com. And then we have Wallaby.js. Wallaby.js is an intelligent, super fast test runner for JavaScript that continuously runs your tests. It reports code coverage and other results directly in your code editor immediately as you change your code. Check them out at wallabyjs.com. And finally, CodeCove. CodeCove is coverage done right. Reduce technical debt by visualizing test performance and faster code review. CodeCove is highly integrated with GitHub and provides browser extensions. Learn more at codecove.io. Great. I'm getting pretty good at saying that. So now, before we get into the show, I just want to remind everybody who's watching live that you can tweet at the show with the hashtag JSAirQuestion. And during the show or at the end of the show, we're going to be answering your questions. And so feel free to grill John about these the concepts of JavaScript utils and Lodash. And then also, our show next week is going to be another live conference show. So really appreciate any feedback that you have on these live conference shows, but it's going to be at FluentConf on March 9th, 2016 at 12:45 p.m. PST. So it will be a couple hours after our normal time, so just be aware of that. But it will be on Wednesday. So yeah, and then as always, follow us on Twitter, Google+, and Facebook to keep up with the latest and greatest from the show. Great. Now with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into introductions. So for our panelists today, we have Brian Lunsdorf.
What's going on?
And Dan Abramoff.
Hey there.
Awesome. And for our guest today, we have John David Dalton.
Hi.
We're so excited to have you. John, why don't you give us a little intro to yourself? And then I think you have something exciting to share with us.
Yeah. All right, so I'm John David Dalton. I'm the lead maintainer on Lodash and creator of Lodash. I also work at Microsoft. I was the former Chakra performance program manager, and so Chakra is the JavaScript engine that's inside of IE9 and up and Edge. It's also one of the, I've worked to make it one of the fastest, and a lot of people have worked to make it the most ES6 compliant too, so that's really cool. Now, though, I work on open source frameworks and libraries to improve the test coverage of them in Edge and make sure that we don't regress in Edge. So that's my day job. Outside of that, though, I do a lot of open source work, and Lodash is part of that. So cool. So the thing that I wanted to do, though, I was asked to do, was to do a version release live on the air. So I'm going to do it. So here it goes. I'm gonna npm publish Lodash 4.6.1. The 0.1 means a patch. So here we go. Let's see.
Fingers crossed.
Oh, I know. Live.
Spend the rest of the show debugging.
Yeah, it doesn't go very well usually.
Here we go.
Lodash has historically been pretty good at non-breaking changes, so.
Yeah.
It has been pushed, and now I will tweet it out. So there it is. Rock. Okay.
All right, npm info Lodash. Let me see this. There it is.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So
Cool.
this,
Yep.
this release.
4.6.1.
Oh,
You
sorry.
saw it here first, folks. Okay, cool. So, John, why don't you go ahead and to kick off our conversation about JavaScript utils and Lodash, can you talk about what Lodash is and give us a bit of a history of this library?
Sure. Lodash is a collection of low-level utility methods. So for iterating arrays, objects, strings. It also has methods for function composition. And I've started to branch off into more functional programming helpers. So things to help you query, things to allow composing functions easier. And that's really what it is. And I just keep iterating on it over the years.
Cool. Can you give us a history of how it got started?
Sure. I started. So I used to work for a startup called Uxibu, and as part of that, I was working on a utilities lib for a component we were developing. And then I also did a JSConf talk on the hidden cost of natives, which was at the time popular. It was popular to say that you would use JS built-ins, so like the array built-ins for ES5, for performance, and that was not actually the case. There was no performance benefit to doing that, and so my talk was just going like through the methods, each one showing how JavaScript library alternatives could be faster. So like 2 days or 4 days after that talk, I released Lodash. Or I'm sorry, I didn't release it. I started Lodash, which was a fork of Underscore at the time. I didn't want to recreate the wheel. I had done something similar to this before from 2008 up to that point, but it was never really released. It never got out of alpha. I did something called Fuse.js. I did a couple of conference talks on that too, which was a drop-in replacement for Prototype.js. That was faster, that didn't augment the built-ins.
Back in the day, Prototype.js.
Yeah. So I kind of had experience doing the same like drop-in, faster alternative thing, except this time I was able to push and release and actually get it out there. And I led with performance because that got a bunch of eyeballs, and I actually regret doing that now because a lot of times people think that's the only thing they think of when they think of Lodash. But I really wanted to improve cross-browser and cross-environment consistency. And I had tried to do that in Underscore first and was unsuccessful in doing that. And so then, 6 months plus later, when I started to work on Lodash, I was able to just to fork and carry on from then. Shortly after that, though, custom builds became a thing. This was before modules took off, though, so I created a build tool, and then modules became a thing, and then now support utility methods through modules as well. So you can just pick and choose the bits that you want instead of having to include a monolithic library. And as time goes on, utility methods increase because everyone wants a utility method, their favorite method included in the library, and we have a process for filtering that out. But over time, it grows. And so now, I mean, it's 21 kilobytes. You don't want that if you only want 2 methods, right? So I made it modular and did a lot of work to try to meet developers where they were. So I supported AMD. There was a time where there was a big pushback against AMD use, and so libraries were dropping support. And I said, you know what? Devs are using it. I'll support it. And they were some of the biggest fans and advocates for Lodash. So great. ES6 is another one where now I support the ES6 module format. So things like Redux, uses it. Yeah, that's kind of how it started. And then I never planned for it to kind of be what it is today. I've tried to just be to remove roadblocks for adoption, because the point of the library is to get utility methods out to as many developers as possible. And so I don't care about your module preference. If you like AMD, if you like ES6, if you like CommonJS, if you like your arguments flipped, if you like, whatever flavor of way that you want to consume these utility methods, the point is to just get you high-quality utility methods. And so I've just tried to do that and be pretty open with module formats and trends for like functional programming and things like that, because at the end of the day, it's still just utilities. And right now, I mean, the popularity of the library is increasing, and so usage is going up. It's starting to chip away against the NIH, or the not invented here, of libraries, and so that's, after like 4 years, I'm starting to get adoption from libraries, which is just a dream come true. So yeah, that's kind of how it started, and its progression is just trying to get utility functions out to developers.
I've got a question. I'm not sure I completely understood. What was the original motivation behind not contributing to underscore but creating another library? Is it that it was hard to contribute, or was it technically hard, or people hard, or?
So at the time, it was a substantial change, and there was roadblocks from adoption, from contributing before. So I had tried to fix some old browser issues before, and that didn't land. But what it did, though, was one of the prerequisites for that patch was to make sure that the change was fast. So basically fixing bugs, but also maintaining performance. So while that ultimately didn't make it into underscore, the things I had to do later on, like drop the built-in use and all other things like that, treat all arrays as dense, these were things that were fundamentally different than underscore at the time, and that were not going to make it in. It was only after they were proved out in Lodash that they were adopted later in underscore, right? So it was kind of like I was stuck, roadblocked, unless I forked, and so I did that. I didn't want to start from scratch, though, so underscore was the established library at the time, so that's the one I based Lodash on.
Cool. So we actually got a question from Twitter that I think is relevant. So again, if you're watching live, the hashtag JSAirQuestion is where you can interact with us during the show, and we'll try to get your questions answered. But this one's from Vile M. Vino, and he asks, if you were doing a Lodash like library totally from scratch, what would be different? Something like Lodash FP?
So Lodash FP is relatively new. I mean, I've been following the uptick of FP, so functional programming, so more functional than that term gets thrown around a lot. Underscore is called a functional library, which because it has some composition, but this is like auto-curried, immutable data, last, iterative first kind of functional programming. I don't know if I would do that first. I still like having that separation and the ability to cater to devs of either preference. It would have been things like I was locked into specific APIs because I forked underscore and needed the drop-in compatibility. But over time, as adoption of Lodash has taken off, I'm able to break away from that and make my own API decisions and choices without having to be tethered to another project. But starting from scratch is tough. And I tried it with, I almost attempted it with that previous project, which was a DOM utility library, which is a lot more complicated than like a language utility library. And so starting from scratch is just, I would say, if you can start from an established point, start there, and then either try to work with them to move the project in the direction you want, or if you have to, fork and go from there. But starting from scratch is tough.
If you're lucky, maybe you can do a spork and like IOJS and bring it back eventually.
Yeah, and we've tried that too. I don't know if that will ever fully happen, but we've so in June or so, I started conversations for a merge of underscore and Lodash to try to get them back together. And what that actually did was that got devs from underscore and devs from Lodash to kind of hash out like things that needed to be done to facilitate a merge. And so part of that shook out was things like the 4 kilobyte build, where the adding utility methods doesn't scale over time. You end up getting this big library. And so one of the things that they wanted was a core build that never grew, that was always just this fundamental set of functions or utilities. And so I was able to do that. They came in, and like Graham and Brad and Justin, they are now contributors to Lodash too. So in that instance, the merge was to reduce duplication of effort, and to help better coordinate our work. And so on that front, it was a success. There are now contributors and help move things along, but it's an ongoing process.
Cool. So actually, on kind of to stay in the theme of what you're talking about with contributors, one thing that just totally amazes me at Lodash is I don't even have to look right now because I'm pretty positive you have 0 issues and 0 pull requests that are open right now.
Now that you said that, someone's probably going to do it.
Yeah, probably better double check that. But if you have any, they're just like a very small amount. Can you talk about how you're able to manage such a wildly popular project, and like how much time do you spend working on this project to just be able to accomplish something so impressive?
So I triage bugs in the morning with my coffee, and then in the evening I do feature work on it. So I spend about 30 or 40 minutes in the morning, and then my evening, if I'm chilling out watching TV, I've usually got a laptop open, and working on a feature or something. I've started this thing where I do at least just a commit a day, and that mechanism of just a commit a day keeps things from adding up and keeps things from becoming this big pile of stuff to do on the weekend. So I do a little bit every day so I can have a life and manage and do other things. I'm married. I mean, like, family and other obligations. So like finding that balance was tricky at first, and it's been something that I've worked on over time. But a little bit in the morning, a little bit in the evening. Now that I work on open source frameworks as my day job, I can sprinkle in a little bit of triage here or there. But the key is to just do a little bit at a time, and then before you know it, you've got 100 commits under your belt in a couple weeks or whatever. So that's how I do it. I also have started to defer more to external contribution. So a lot of times developers will say, "Hey, can you just fix your documentation?" They'll say that of me, right? And I'll say, "Well, how about you fix the documentation? The wiki is open. Like you can add your own fixes to it." So I encourage them to do that. If it's a really tiny change, I just say, "Hey, let's create a pull request and get you involved with contribution and actually have you as part of the contributors of Lodash." And that has helped a lot too. It's just push it, and people are more than willing to help out. I try also not to be as nitpicky when it comes to accepting pull requests. A lot of times I don't make like the style guide a prerequisite to hit for the build to pass, because worst case, I'll go back afterwards and do a cleanup pass, right? I feel like bike shedding, all of that stuff is just a barrier for contribution, so I try to be very eager with accepting a pull request once they sign a CLA if needed, and then go from there. And so that has kind of helped spread the responsibility and spread the workload out. But yeah, it's just a little bit every day.
I think that's just wildly impressive. That's very cool. And I think a lot of really good pro tips in there about how to manage open source projects. So hopefully that is helpful to people.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that this is more out of curiosity and maybe tangential, but you mentioned that your work is now on libraries, open source libraries and frameworks. And so like that's part of your day job. What exactly are you doing for that?
So what we've been doing is things like ensuring that all of the jQuery unit tests pass in Edge. And that means either filing bugs on Edge, the browser, or on jQuery's repo to fix like a faulty unit test or a faulty check. But then we do that for things like Ember, Angular, and the list goes on and on and on and on. And so usually things revolve around making sure our test coverage is up to ideally 100% passing on these JavaScript libraries, and assisting when it's not, or ensuring or filing bugs on our end. I also do things like app building exercises to shake out bugs in our platform. So last month we did a React app, which was a Markdown editor, and that shook out some bugs on our end with the old school like document exec command thing, which is pretty gross, uncontent editable, and also extended edge support and edge testing support to the Medium plugin like text editor widget. So I mean that in that case that was a pretty big success there. So and so this month I'm looking at Angular 1 and RxJS, and so I'll be shaking out bugs there. And so I've got a team of 2 others, Zach and Jesse, and so you'll see them probably pop into Ember or jQuery or whatever library we're focusing on, and they'll be helping with bugs there too. So yeah, I mean it's also nice too, because a lot of times in my off time I focus in on utilities, and I don't get to try some of the cooler things like React or Redux or Babel, or the list goes on and on and on. And so this is now a time where I don't have to just kind of work it into my unit testing for Lodash. I can actually sit there and try to build an application and kind of shake out and get more familiar with these projects.
Are you finding some of your own utility methods more or less useful when you start to apply it to application building? Like, are you like, oh, I use zip all the time now. I never used zip before, or whatever.
Well, so I try to. So part of our thing is we box it to just like 2 days to do the app building, which is usually enough time to shake out any issues with just getting the project off the ground and then creating a minimal viable application. I do try to sneak Lodash in there if I can, but usually we try to focus it primarily on the framework or library that we're looking at, and try to reduce outside factors so we can.
Sure. But I guess in general, what are some of your favorite utility methods from Lodash that you find useful that maybe people aren't too familiar with, or maybe they are?
I can tell you a couple of them that I thought, man, I'll never use this, never, and then they became one of my favorite things. One of them was placeholders in partial application. I would, when that feature first came across underscore's radar, I was like, ugh, I'm gonna have to add this to Lodash now, and I was so upset. But it's become super handy for partial application. What a placeholder is it allows you to pass an object. In this case, it's the underscore or Lodash namespace as the placeholder, so you can skip over that and say. Which it's really hard to explain this with hands, but whatever. You have an argument A, you want to skip that and provide argument B. And so then whenever you execute the function, you then provide argument A, and B has already been provided for you. And so the way to signal that is to have a placeholder that is the placeholder of A and allows you to specify B. The other one that I found super useful was the REST function, which is similar to like ES6 REST. And Graham and Justin proposed that method, and at the time I was like, yeah, okay, I mean, it's in ES6, and then it became one of the most used functions in the entire library for defining all the other methods. So like that alone, REST is one of my favorite methods in there to work with.
Nice. AKA Twitter. Sorry, I don't hear you now. I'm going to mute for a second.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I just muted John. Sometimes this happens in the middle of the show that like we start getting crazy feedback, and so just a reminder, when you're not talking, make sure to mute yourself. And if you're on a Mac, that's Command D. If you're on Windows, I think that's Control D. So go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, Well, I have one more question since I have the the mic. I was curious. I think a lot of people admire your performance, your attention to performance, and how good you are at like debugging things and making sure it's very optimized. Could you speak to your workflow of like how you approach optimization?
Testing. All right, I'm back. So what I usually do is look for an established common case, and make sure that that common case is fast, and that the external or overloaded functionality comes second, or the extra functionality comes second. I also do it around scenarios. So I try not to obsess over micro optimizations. I would say don't focus on that. Don't worry about the direction of your while loop. Don't worry about how you increment your variables. Don't worry about array push versus assigning it directly to the array. None of that stuff really matters in the long run. Usually, the things that have become significant are things like avoiding linear lookups for like uniquing and differencing and intersecting arrays. Or introducing lazy evaluation and shortcut fusion to reduce tons and tons of iteration, and those are the kinds of things that win performance, and those are the things that developers tend to appreciate. Like when they switch from one library to the next, they go, "Wow! Like my node process is just so much more improved because of things like this." Because Lodash is now used by quite a few people, I tend to get the scenarios brought to me now, but before I was just kind of having to look at the issues that were posted over and over on either underscore or Lodash's tracker to focus on perf work. But now I make sure that the common case is fast, and then if there's not a competitive edge either, the method tends to get a lower priority. So at the moment, I have things for like deep property crawling or string methods, and because there's not a direct competition where someone has called out perf on those, I tend to let those slide a bit until someone brings up like, hey, this thing is causing me some grief. But yeah, and when I do it, I don't focus on one engine. I know it's really popular to just make sure it runs fast in Node, but I make sure that what I've done works fast in Edge, in IE, in Firefox, in Safari, in Chrome, and in Node. Newer and older versions of Node, I try to balance that out too. And so that is really kind of pays off, because a lot of times you'll see like the competition go like, hey, we're fast in this or that, and I'll be like, well, that's one environment. Now try the other 5 where it like syncs performance. And it's something to keep in mind. And so because I've also have an experience or a background with being the perf PM on an engine, I kind of know the fast paths for V8, for SpiderMonkey, for Chakra, and so I can navigate those and make sure that what I have ends up being great for any engine.
That's awesome. So like obviously you're not going to be well, I wouldn't expect that you run these tests manually in each one of these browsers and environments. What do you use to automate these benchmarks, or are you doing it manually?
So I do actually do it manually. I have a benchmark suite that I maintain for Lodash, which makes sure that its methods are fast and I can compare them against previous versions of Lodash or underscore. And I do those before any major release. I make sure that I haven't regressed. And so usually the perf suite isn't there to show off perf. It's usually hitting my worst case scenarios. And that's what I'm checking for, to see that my worst case scenarios haven't become prohibitively slow. And I check those. If I'm doing more new feature work, I'll create a benchmark either using JSPerf, which is having a little bit of problems at the moment, or creating my own benchmark, and then I just run it across various engines. So some of the stuff I do is based on kind of like a heuristic, and so I pick like a happy medium across the engines. So for example, I have large array optimizations where I kick in and use ES6 set or map to avoid linear lookup of large arrays. But at some point, I have to specify what a large array is. And so in my case, it's 200. Once you hit the 200 elements, that's where the cost of using set or map washes out around other engines. And some kick in sooner, some kick in later, but that's the happy medium there. So by testing them in various engines, you kind of get a better idea of where to set those. But yeah, no, it's manual. But my environment, I used to have hundreds of browsers and versions, and I've since trimmed them down to just the current and then the previous one behind it on version numbers, except for the IEs, where I have 9, 10, 11, and so on. But yeah, that's how I did it.
Very cool. So I think that there might be some people watching right now who are in like one of two camps, or maybe both. Like, well, probably not both, but people who really want to get into open source but never have, or have only done a little bit, and they're just not sure where to start. And then other people who are like project maintainers or want to start a project. And I think your experience could really provide a lot of value to those people. So could you give some tips first to the group of people who want to get into open source but just haven't really gotten around to it? What would you say to those people? How do they get involved in contributing to open source, whether it be Lodash or anything in general?
So usually I would say find something you're passionate about. If it's dates and times, if it's CSS, if it's there's so many areas in JavaScript or web related stuff, or even non-webby stuff to dig into. If you're passionate about something, there's probably a group somewhere or a project somewhere that you could pick up and start contributing to. GitHub makes it easier with like help wanted labels, or there's like a first timers only pull request labels, which help allow you to kind of pick out which ones would be a good place to start contributing to a project. I know Chakra, which was recently open sourced, has like a first PR label in there, so people that are wanting to get their feet wet with some of the C++ and some of the engine stuff can jump in there. I have help wanted labels for my issues. I haven't started the first timers only, but that would be a good way to do that too. Also, I see a lot of first timers, they'll jump in on documentation because documentation is kind of an easy place to get in, and to document something you have to kind of dig into the source code and be familiar with it. And so that's kind of a way to force familiarity and understanding of the project, is to try to actually document what something is doing. In terms of maintainers, I would say if you're wanting to encourage first-time contribution, label it and lower the barriers of contribution down. I know some people they'll have their code style and their linters as the first things that fail, and a lot of times that's extra setup for an extra process for a first-time contributor, and I tend to make those optional fails or make those things that I do on a follow-up run. And so mainly it's just like saying, hey, thank you for contributing, so thank the users, and then make it easy for them to contribute, and try not to bog them down at first. So I ease contributors into the process, and so after they've contributed a couple times, I'll start to nitpick style and format and things like that. Once I see that they're becoming a regular contributor now, I'll start to ratchet up the requirements for getting something to pass in. But yeah, I would say just be open to it. If you're running a project and you don't want to run the project anymore, which happens. I mean, like I've got a couple projects where I was no longer interested in maintaining it, so I looked for someone who wanted to help and said, hey, here's commit rights, here's publish rights to this package, so you can keep maintaining it and keeping it going along. So I'd say be open to sharing control. I made sure that with Lodash, I'm not the only one that has publish rights and maintainer rights to this. So if I was to ever burn out or leave, there was other people to step in and carry on the project. So, yep.
Awesome. Yeah, I've actually got a follow-up question to one of the things that you mentioned. So I think it's great that you avoid nitpicking on new contributors. I think that makes it more likely that people will contribute again. So what do you do? Like obviously, you want to maintain your style and you want to maintain a certain level of quality in your code. That's why we have linters. And so what do you do? Like you're gonna merge that pull request and then update it later. How do you do that? Like does your Git history just look like a bunch of first time commits and then you fixing up along the way, or how does that really pan out?
So I'll either amend or do a follow-up commit depending on how bad it is. If it's just like a comma or something like that, I'll pop in and do an assist. Usually commits are pretty small, and so there's not a large chunk of code that needs to be refactored. As long as the commits are small and granular, it's never really been a problem of trying to make sure things look right or are formatted correctly. I do have a style checker though, so you can go npm run style, which then checks all of the wrappers, all of the unit tests, the entire code base for code style rules, and then they'll flag problems. So I'll do that usually before I do a release or after a pull request that gets merged. But I tend to merge. I merge away the merge commits, so it just looks like a steady stream of users contributing without a bunch of the process stuff in the way.
Cool. How do you? Sorry, I'm a project maintainer, so I've got these maybe specific questions. Hopefully, they're helpful to people. How do you manage your So what you're talking about is you want to rebase that their branch onto master, so you don't have a bunch of merge commits. But that's not possible to do with the merge button in GitHub, right? So do you make sure that their branch is rebased first, and then you can do it manually? Because if you don't do that, then you're actually creating a brand new commit, and that pull request, GitHub won't recognize that pull request is merged, and then you wind up closing it. Like, is that kind of how you do that? You just close it and say, no, this was merged, I promise, or how do you?
No, I make sure that they see that it's merged. So I click the merge button, and then I go back. I pull it down. It's got the merge commit in there, and then I usually just rebase the merge message out of that, and then force push up. So they maintain contribution rights. It shows them as the contributor. It just shows me as a little icon next to it that says, "Hey, I assisted in cleaning it up." But they get the credit. It closes and is tracked in in GitHub, and that's how I do that. That can cause some problems. Rebasing can cause problems when people fork it and then all of a sudden it's been rebased, right? And so it could cause commits, and I've had it happen where it's like hundreds of commits and then they're one change. But it's easy enough to have them rebase again and just say, hey, sorry about this. You happened to do your branch or your fork right as I was merging someone else's stuff. Could you just rebase through? And if they don't know how, I'll just paste the commands that they basically copy paste into their console, and it clears things up for them, and then we go on from there. But overall, it hasn't been a big deal. Yeah.
I was going to mention just for open source contribution, you've made it so easy to eliminate the fear of ruining your project with a commit, with a good test suite, and I think that's a huge boon for people who want to contribute. They can just easily make sure they didn't destroy the whole thing.
Yeah, I've over the years I've tried to increase our test coverage. So at the moment we have 99.9 something test coverage, and that's test coverage only works on a single pass, right? And so the rest of that fraction of a percent is actually covered through the browser runs, which are automated, and the other environment runs that are automated. So yeah, those have helped make sure that I don't break anything. I also have build tests on the CLI side. So when I do large refactoring there, or adding a method, or change dependencies up, it'll let me know real quick if I've broken something. But I've tried over the years to make things a little bit more fluid, a little bit more forgiving, so people can add methods now, and it doesn't break the suite. or break the custom build. And so anything that's been kind of a barrier there, I've tried to remove and allow more contributions. And it's actually worked. Before, I used to have a real problem getting external contributors, but over the last year and a half or so, it's just been a steady increase in contribution. And part of that was I removed a lot of the too clever JavaScript stuff, where I used to have like a template that was designed for HTML, and I used to have it generate the function body of a core helper function. And that was just, people would hit that and then stop and then walk away. And so I removed that and then made everything just these tiny, tiny helper functions and these tiny modules, and that has just made it so much easier for people to read through the source, to figure it out. I do JS doc style comments too, and I make sure that if there's something that's a little awkward in the code, I try to document that so people know like exactly why I'm doing something. Oh, there's a bug in this version of the browser. That's why this code's formatted this way. So if you change that, you'll probably hit a test fail, things like that.
Cool. I think you just gave us a whole bunch of awesome pro tips for not only open source but like coding in general. I think that's really valuable. And I'm going to just go ahead and give a +1 from Getify right here, because if he were here, I'm sure he would +1 that your motivation to keep the cleverness down.
Do +1 on my behalf.
Yeah.
He's gonna pop in.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I try to make it is a lot of times, like I'll even do this where I'm looking at like, should I use a ternary operator here? Because I can make it a string of ternary operations, right? Or just break it into like an if-else. Break it into an if-else. I mean, in the long run, it's going to be easier to understand, and so I've tried to do that. I do use that. That doesn't mean that things can't get complicated. It just means that you have to document those complicated things or have a good reason for them to be there. So I do have tricky spots. Like I use a bit mask, which can be something that devs haven't encountered before, but I use that to avoid passing like 14 or 16 argument parameters, right? And I use that as a key component of keeping the cost of currying down. So it's this centralized bit, but I abstract that away to just this one function, this one scary function, right? So if you're not dealing with that one little bit, you never see it. You don't have to interface with it. It's not spread through all the other code base. It's just isolated. So I try to isolate the ugly bits to avoid making it harder for contributions.
I think I'm gonna have to change the name of the show because we've talked about Lodash, we've talked about JavaScript utils. That's been really valuable. But I think lots of the really valuable things I'm taking away from the show are the pro tips that we're getting about managing an open source project, contributing to an open source project, and writing code.
Well, I have a question on the actual utility part, and that's really just. In my experience, I have much better luck understanding a program when my function does one thing, and JavaScript is historically like you give this function takes 4 different arguments, does 20 different things based on your combination of type and arguments, arity, and things like that. And then that's really to the heart of what JavaScript is and its normal utilities and things like that. So I'm not there anything against that, but I'm wondering what your thoughts or experience was working with all these like Swiss Army kind of functions instead of A to B functions.
Great question. Man, over the years I've actually started to reduce overloading because overloading is a nightmare for modularity. Overloading means that you have a function that can accept multiple arguments and behave differently. So like if you pass it an array, it does one thing. If you pass it an object, it does another thing. If you pass it a function as the second parameter, it does an entirely new thing. Or a Boolean value. So as the focus has shifted from monolithic to modular, it forces you to avoid overloading because people don't want to have 5 kilobytes of sugar for something they're never going to use. And so with Lodash 4, I have I have started to break out that overloaded stuff into individual methods. So for example, unique. Unique used to take a Boolean value that would say that it was a sorted unique. Instead, now I have a method called sorted unique. Or it used to take that same Boolean, could be a function, and it would use that function's result as the criteria for the unique value. And so now I have a function called unique by, which then allows you to pass that function, so it's not overloaded into a single piece. And so that simplifies the argument signature, which makes it easier for things like definitely typed TypeScript definitions. It simplifies the implementation. It allows for more granular modularity and for smaller builds. So nowadays, if I get a new method, I try to just split it out. I don't want overloading. There's some things that are stuck the way they are, and I'm okay with it, like the collections methods, which accept an array, an object, a string. But those I'm not growing that set. That set is pretty much set in stone. This forward is now like, let's just have an array method, let's just have an object method, let's just have a string method. So I'm keeping overloading to a minimum and simplifying it for all the benefits I just talked about.
Yeah, I think I actually hit one of those with the Redux when I attempted to use map values, which is like simple in the simple case, but it also does a ton of stuff in the more complicated case that blows up Redux size 2 times.
So this is something we addressed with version 4. Most of these methods that accept an iteratee, like a map or every or filter, have callback sugar in there for shorthand. So instead of passing a function, you can pass a string, like a property name, or an object to create a predicate function that does a partial deep comparison. But that alone is 5 kilobytes. That sugar is massive because it's doing deep partial object comparison, right? Super gross when I just want to map some values. Like, why do I have to have 5 kilobytes of this? I'm never going to use it. So Webpack gives you this really cool ability to map and remap module requires. And so you can take that instead. There's a way to say, like, instead of using the callback helper that is in charge of shorthands, to point it to a method that just returns the function. And when you do that, you cut out the 5 kilobytes. So if you were to use that today, that's what I would do. Is I would use Webpack to remap that one request to the simpler form, and then avoid the.
But this is a bit like reaching out into internals, right? Because I have to rely on internal method names or model names.
But Lodash is developed with that in mind. So what we do is every external function has a simplified internal function. So if there's anything where you're having to do extra work, there's usually, I won't say always, but there's usually a simplified internal function. And what we do is externally we don't do backwards compat breaking changes unless it's a major bump. For internal methods, we do the minor bump. So all you have to do is switch your caret to a tilde, and then you should be good to go.
Very cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I am afraid that we're going to have to wrap things up here. This has been really great. Thank you for coming on the show. Let's go ahead and we'll get into our tips and picks. But before we do that, actually, I just want to ask you, John, if there was anything else that you wanted to bring up.
No, this has been great. I will say, if you have any questions, ping me on Twitter, ping me on GitHub. There's a Gitter chat as well. Don't be afraid to reach out. My DMs are unlocked too, so you can DM me. Anyone can do that. So I would say, yeah, just reach out. I am anything. I'll sit there, and if I can't help you, I'll find someone that can help you.
That's very nice of you, and a great example to us. Thank you. Cool. So let's go ahead and we'll get into our tips and picks. Brian, why don't we have you go first?
Sure. Just have a really small set of picks today. Mainly, should give a shout out to the PureScript Online meetup. That's back, so check that out on meetup.com. Just look for PureScript. Put a link there. And then I ran across this amazing, robot Lolita post that this guy Jesse posted, and it's really, really great read. So there's that. And then the continuation monad is incredible, and there's a lot of interesting uses of it with generators. There's a I posted a link. Look at Scott Christopher's const t screenshots. They'll blow your mind.
Cool. Thanks. Dan, why don't I have you go next?
So I have a bunch of picks this time, and my first pick is going to be something called GraphViz, and in particular an Atom plugin for this thing called GraphViz Preview, which is an awesome way of creating, like, if you want to create a flowchart with like arrows between boxes, which can be of different shapes, and if you hate doing it manually, you can just create a text file in a special language, and the tool is going to arrange these boxes for you, and it's cross-platform, and it's pretty awesome, and this Atom plugin just puts the preview side by side so you can see how it works. My other pick is something called WTF, which is not what you think. It's Web Tracing Framework by Google, and this is a JavaScript framework that is like super awesome. I just played with it a little bit, and this is like, it lets you put traces in your code. For example, like, I'm entering this method and I'm leaving this method, and to log events as well, and then it exports a trace that can be opened in a special Chrome or Firefox extension, and you can see the flame chart, all the stack of the calls, and you can zoom in, zoom out, you can look for things by filtering, and it's super awesome. I recommend it. It's great for debugging performance issues. So another thing is, I wrote, like I said, about the flowchart. So the reason I was looking for a tool to create a flowchart is because I was creating a flowchart. So I published a flowchart called React Makes You Sad, which is a common sentiment I hear these days from people who just come into JavaScript programming, see React, Google React boilerplate, and see a bunch of projects that are super complicated and think that, like, this is what you need to have in order to use React, which is not true. So I just made a flowchart that kind of tells you that you don't have to use all of this. You probably don't need Flux. You don't need like routing. You don't need all these kind of fancy build tools, because React, it's best to start by learning React itself, and then you can add things as necessary for your project incrementally. So there's that. And finally, our conversation about built-ins reminded me of an old comment by Petka Antonov, who's one of the authors of Bluebird Promise Library, about how it is often, people often think that built-ins are bound to be faster because they're in native code. So this is a great comment explaining why this is not exactly the case, and why built-ins are often slower than JavaScript implementations. That's it.
Wow, that was awesome. I totally didn't get your last pick because I'm looking at this React Makes You Sad thing. I'll have to listen to it again. That was great. I'm going to pick that too. Very cool. So I have one tip: do open source. It's great. I think I've given that as a tip before, but I just think it's great. So my picks, I have 3. React.js program by our friend Tyler McGinnis, one of our panelists. I wish that he could be here to talk about how great this is, but it's basically a training website where you can register for a course, and there's a video. Like you follow along with the video and build an app, and it's super, super cool. There's the first course is totally free, so go check that out. And that's React.js program. And then Healthy Open Source is a blog post by the is it Mikkel, I think, from the Node project. This has kind of changed the way that I think about maintaining open source projects. So I really recommend that you look into it. I've already started implementing some of the ideas here, and it's already had a big impact on my project. So very cool. And then finally, all contributors. All contributors is a thing that I started just last week. That basically the tagline is recognize all contributors, not just the ones who push code. And so GitHub is really good at showing you these are the people who've committed to this project, and that's great. But there are so many people who contribute to a project who aren't pushing code, And so the purpose of this project is to recognize those people in a prominent place in your project because they're really providing a great deal of value to your project. So check that out. And yeah, let's go with you, John. What do you have for us?
I want to comment on your all contributors. So I'm kind of the workhorse on my project. I do the commits every day, but a large part of operations and core is just bike shedding API, figuring out the direction of features, and none of that's really code push related. But it's a big help, and you can't do it. You can't run the project without it. So yeah, that's great. Non-core, non-code contributions are super important. For my picks, though, since I didn't mention in the conversation, I'll take some of those. One of them is the Babel plugin Lodash, which is our official Babel plugin for simplifying paths. So you can use Lodash as a monolith, as the monolithic invocation, and then it will automatically break everything into paths for you. The other one is ESLint plugin Lodash. I like the convention there for the name. And this is not a Lodash core thing, but it allows you to lint your projects for specific versions of Lodash. So like you can lint it for best practices for Lodash version 3, for Lodash version 4, and it helps. I've seen it help with folks migrating from one version to the next. So I would say check that out. The other thing I want to mention is there's a blog post called "Why Using Chain is a Mistake." It's a little bit like clickbaity titled, but the post is super thorough. Gets into functional programming concepts, gets into using composition instead of chaining, and is a really good read. I would say it's probably appropriate for like a Friday afternoon read because it is a little bit longer than some blog posts, but it's super good. My tip would be if you're wanting to up your JavaScript knowledge, the best way to do that, at least for me, has been to dig into a project. That's how I learned. That's how I relearned JavaScript was digging into prototype, digging into jQuery, digging into MooTools, digging into underscore, digging into all these frameworks and libraries, and it just once you dig in and you start to figure out how things work, it really helps get past and it helps you understand a lot of these harder programming concepts in JavaScript. So I would say just dig into the source code and just start taking stuff apart. See what happens if you change a value here or a variable there, and explore.
Cool. Awesome. Great. So I think that is it for our show. John, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate you and your efforts. And with that, I think I'll just wrap us up. So for some of our regular closing announcements, remember if you have any suggestions for topics or guests, go to suggest.javascriptair.com to suggest shows that we should do. And then if you have feedback for this show or the show in general, please go to feedback.javascriptair.com, and we love feedback, so please give us some, especially about the live conference shows, because we do have a couple more coming up, and I want to make sure that those are what you want them to be. Great, and then just in general, next week is a live conference show. It's live at FluentConf, and really excited about this one. It's going to be March 9th at 12:45 p.m. PST, and John is showing off his Thunder Plains shirt there. Hopefully, maybe we can get a live show at that conference this year too. That'd be sweet. Yeah, and then remember to follow us on Twitter and Google Plus and Facebook to keep up with the latest. And I think that's it. Oh, one other thing. So if you want to join an weekly email list with the show notes and things like that, we're planning on actually doing this. Go to jsair.io/email and register yourself to be on the email list. And I think that's it. So thank you so much, John, and we'll catch everybody later.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.